Africa. And it turns out the only habituated community, we're hearing about habituated communities of chimps, that has SIV, although it's quite common in populations all through the Congo and Cameroon, is Gombe. And Gombe does have chimps infected with SIV. Now, there's some preliminary data coming along which suggests that actually it might be pathogenic to some extent. So, so here's an opportunity to look at variation and possibly resistance. There's one other thing I'd like to say on that same topic of human evolution. So are humans still evolving? David talked about malaria, but there's another very interesting example of lactose intolerance, or tolerance rather, the lactose tolerance gene. Most of us probably in this room can drink milk and digest it just fine, but there are lots of people in the world who can't, and it turns out that there seems to be a recent adaptation to be able to continue to digest milk that has evolved in tandem with people keeping cattle and having milk in their diet. And people who have not historically had milk in their diet cannot digest milk after they're weaned.
Interesting. Last question.
So recently there's been more and more evidence that birds can do some impressive things in terms of their perceptual abilities and cognitive abilities. Like we learned about frontally placed eyes and binocular vision, which occurs in owls, and there are crows that use tools in the wild and can fabricate tools in the lab to get food rewards. And jays are reported to be able to hide their food, and if they think someone's watched them hide their food, they'll wait and then re-hide it when they're not being watched. And so I'm interested in hearing the reaction of primate researchers to these recent developments in birds. Is it threatening?
Joan is chomping at the bit here. Joan?
I think it's a great point that the more we learn about primates, our colleagues who are incredibly envious of us having such incredibly attractive study animals are competing to find discoveries in their own taxa. But what I think more generally, it's really fantastic because it helps us ask the question, what are the selective pressures that favor certain kinds of behavioral adaptations? So for the jays, it turns out if you make your living, if you hide your food and rely on that food being there in the winter so that you don't starve to death, you're pretty darn worried about whether or not it's going to get stolen. So certain kinds of...
Excuse me. That was not an editorial comment.
Okay. Certain kinds of selective pressures have favored certain kinds of cognitive abilities. And that's a great insight. And when we only look at primates in one particular evolutionary lineage, it's really hard to kind of make, to test hypotheses because hypotheses are best tested with comparative data. So in a lot of ways, these discoveries, even though they were, I'm sure, inspired by immense envy of our wonderful animals, have been, I think, terrifically exciting.
I have one last question before I go to lunch, and that is, you've all been doing this research for many years. We're now on our 40th anniversary of the Leakey Foundation and all this research. And I'd ask you this simple question. If you had to do it all over again, what would you do differently? You know, hindsight's 20/20. And knowing what you know now about your methodology, about what you've learned, about what focuses you've put on certain areas, would you not change anything, or would you do what you have done a lot differently? Joan? Flexing your eyebrows at me. We'll go down the line. We'll go down the road. We start at the end, Joan, if you want to go first.
Well, I've been thinking the last 2 days at this meeting just how incredibly lucky it is that I was able to do this work. A lot of my very close friends are here, and I think about how great it's been to have known them and worked with them all these years. And so even though mistakes have been made and, regrets might be there, I think I just feel, if I did it all over again, it couldn't possibly have come out so well.
Diane, do you have any thoughts?
Well, one of the things that I did was similar to what Professor Yamagiwa did, and that is to study Western gorillas. And they have been notoriously difficult to habituate to human observation. So although we've studied chimpanzees for almost 50 years, there have been almost no studies of habituated Western gorillas. And so if I had to do it over again, I would have habituated them in 2 years instead of 10. And now I know how to do that.
You know how to do that?
Yeah.
We won't get into that. That's for a later for lunch. David?
There are many directions in which I could go with an answer to that question. I should say first that I feel incredibly privileged to have had the opportunities that I've had to study great apes in the wild. And Joan said earlier that we're always carrying on our internal and sometimes auditory dialogue with them. I haven't yet to have one answer me about, oh, well, why did you do that, and what's going on now, and oh, no, that was stupid, and so on. Most people wouldn't want to have spent as much time doing it as I have, if any, but I, with a lot of help from the Leakey Foundation, feel very fortunate to have been able to do that. If there were anything that I might have benefited from had I done it differently, I suppose I would say maybe spend a little less time out in the forest and a little more time learning things like how to plan a controlled experiment or how to do hormonal assays so that I could do them myself instead of relying on other people to do them. But it's not that I could do really elegant controlled experiments in the wild, but I think it does certainly help focus your attention on how to do observational work better if you pay as much attention as possible to how you define, how you come up with an experiment where you do have much more control over things than you could possibly have in the wild. And things like playback experiments are somewhere in between. But again, to meet the challenges of doing a playback experiment really requires some rigorous thought. So I might have benefited from a little more of that.
All right. Anne?
Well, besides what I said before, collect feces right from the beginning. Because not only, we would be able to know all about the genetic relationships, which we do know now from more recent times, but because they're such long-lived animals, it would have been great to have genetic samples right from the beginning. But I do think that there's really no shortcut except for these long focal observations that people have been doing over the years to find out what we found out. And for example, I think we know in some sites more than others about female relationships because of the ability to follow females even when they're by themselves. That was easier to do early on in places like Gombe than it has been. I mean, now it's happening everywhere. But it takes a long time to see these rare but very important events, and I think we've done a pretty good job.
Dr. Nishida?
No, I mentioned yesterday culture hunting. I visited Gogo and found different culture. So I should have visited many more sites and spend at least 1 month. And I would have found many differences of behavior, I think.
All right, thank you all, Dr. Nishida, Dr. Fusi, Dr. Watts, Dr. Doran Shi, and Dr. Sill. Thank you all for taking time to be with us this morning.